Let's see whether we can get started while we're waiting for the text. And thank you, Rabbi Green, for the introduction. I've been told that the title of our course, Mipnei Tikkun Olam, Mipnei Drachei Shalom, how Chazal used halacha to promote a vision for better society, just doesn't explain enough. So let me try. Out of the myriad, the thousands of halachot, which are given voice by the Tanaim in the Mishnah, in the Mechilta, in Midrashei halacha which was evolved and articulated during what we think of as the Tanaitic, the Mishnaic period. Several dozen of those thousands and thousands of halachot are given reason by the Mishnah. And those reasons point to the Mishnah's desire to help alleviate certain problems that exist by earlier halachot. And they follow that the Mishnah Tikkun Olam for the sake of the betterment or improving the world. The second is Mipnei Darchei HaShalom, for the betterment of the for the sake of the paths of peace, and the third is Mipnei HaEva, for the sake of avoiding hostility. Now, this notion that halacha might have been intended to help impact society, or to take into account human nature and to help human beings grow in a certain way, might be controversial in some quarters. It should not be. The Ramban, Nachmanides, even in the 13th century, understood that halacha, even Torah halacha, played that role. So, for instance, his response to the Mishnah, which learns if one says in davening, God have mercy on me as you have on the mother bird, referring to the mitzvah of shiluach haken, of sending away the mother bird. The Mishnah says that person should be silenced. The Gemara, in explaining that, says because we cannot ascribe characteristics to God, midot Hashem, to specific mitzvot. The Ramban says that's right. We can't ascribe midot Hashem, the characteristics of God, to certain mitzvot. But what we can do is understand the midot that Hashem wants us to develop. And so, the mitzvah of shiluach haken, for example, the Ramban understands as coming not to tell us that God is merciful, but to tell us that God wants us to be merciful. That God wants us to create a society that's based on mercy. That's an example of based on the Ramban, of the use of halacha to either address a problem in society, people by nature not being merciful, or to help shape the human being as we evolve through shmirat ha-mitzvot, through the observance of mitzvot. So we will look at, it should not be surprising then that the Tanaim, in developing Hilchot Midrabanan, in developing the basis for their understanding of halacha, that they would occasionally refer to their societal goals to explain why they are understanding a particular halacha or even creating a halacha in one direction or in another. The first example that we're going to look at, okay, I'm sharing now, but I have to get to let's see how I can do this. Can people see the text that's being shared? Hello? Yes, you're shaking your head, yes? Are you all muted? I can't.
We sort of have two texts, one and the other.
Here. Okay, here it is. So let's take a look at the first Mishnah. Now, let me say that every All of our texts are available in both Hebrew and in English, and I will turn to the English translation for the text, even though in reading it I may be using the Hebrew. So our first Mishnah deals with the whole question of Gittin. It's not surprising that Gittin would be the first Mishnah that's brought in the entirety of Mishnah that brings halacha ascribed to mipnei tikkun olam, for the sake of the betterment of the world. Since after all, the subject that Mishnah deals with, the subject of divorce, is full of the possibility of contention and hostility. The sort of thing that the Chazal would try to take into account and help alleviate. Gittin themselves is based on a dioraita. I mean, we learn in Parshat Ki Teitzei and Dvarim that if a man chooses to divorce his wife, what he needs to do is v'katab la sefer kritut, that he should write for her a document of separation, v'natan la biyada, and he would give it to her in her hand. That's all that the Torah says about the creation of a get, and that is the dioraita. That's the Torah requirement. Everything else, all of the myriad of details that refer to that relates to giving a get and creating a get and signing a get and how it gets written and how it's to be delivered, etc., all of that becomes d'Rabbanan. It's all created by Chazal in order to actualize, in order to be able to implement the Torah's requirement for a written document which is handed to her. Our Mishnah deals with one aspect of that process. It deals with what occurs when a man who has had a get written for his wife, has not yet had it delivered, and chooses to nullify it. He says, oh my God, what did I do? Her cholent is magnificent. How can I give that up? I regret this. I want to cancel it. As we'll learn in the second Mishnah, the original practice was very simple. The original practice created by the rabbis was that a man who chose to nullify his life, who decided that the cholent was worth everything else that he had to put up with, neglecting to say, of course, what it was that she had to put up with, that what he would do would simply create a beit din wherever he was, b'makom acher, in a place that was not where he lived and not where she lived, and go to the beit din and say, I nullify the get. I have charata. I regret that I ever made it. And so long as the nullification occurred before the get was actually delivered, it was nullified. That halacha, as we'll learn in the Mishnah and the Gemara in just a few moments, was changed mipnei tikkun olam, for the sake of the betterment of the olam of the world. And the Gemara will discuss exactly what that means. Our first Mishnah, the one that we're going to look at now, deals with the aftermath of that change and tells us about what the rabbis were concerned about as they observed the impact that their halacha was having on the men and the women, or the man and the woman who were involved in this get. So the Mishnah reads, Hashaleach get leishto b'higia b'shliach. If a man sends a get to his wife through an agent, through a shaliach, the practice was that he could either deliver it personally, no one wanted to do that, or that he could send the get through a shaliach, through an agent. So a man sends a get to his wife through an agent, since he can no longer just go to a beit din, and then he has charata. So he meets the agent along the way, and he tells the agent, the get that I gave to you is void, the get that I gave to you is void. Or, if a man sends a second agent after the first, and the second agent reaches the first agent, the agent who actually has the get, getting ready to deliver it, and says, Shlomi said, forget it. He doesn't want to deliver the get. Or the man goes to his wife, to the wife herself, and says, "You know what, darling, I love your cholent. I sent you a get. I am so sorry. I know you haven't received it yet. It's voided." All of that is allowed, but once the get reaches the wife, it can no longer be made void. Referring back to their understanding of the Torah requirement that one writes a get for her and gives it to her. The implementation of the get occurs with the receiving of it, when the woman or her agent receives the get and not before. Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara here, and we'll understand what were the rabbis thinking, what were they concerned about. So first the Gemara begins, Higiu lo katani ela hagia. Makes the point, the Mishnah uses an odd form of language. It doesn't say he reached the agent who was carrying the get, but rather he met him even by happenstance. He hadn't intended to meet him, but they happened to be in the same bar on the way to the woman's house. So even then, if he says, I want to avoid the get, we allow him to do that. Why? Because we do not assume that the husband's intent is to vex his wife. What does that mean? That we don't assume that the husband's intent is to vex his wife. What are the rabbis of the Gemara? How do the rabbis of the Gemara understand the rabbis of the Mishnah who actually created this halacha? What do they want to see, and what do they not want to see? This is a text study, and in a text study, of course, we all have opinions and help analyze the text. Anyone? No? Okay. So as I understand the text, thank you. As I understand the text, the issue here is the rabbis, in creating this new halacha, the halacha which allows the husband to void the text through an agent or through himself, as long as the get has not yet reached the wife, rather than simply creating a beit din and doing it the old way. What if this allows him simply to play games with her, to play mind games? I'm going to send you a get. I'm not going to send you a get. I sent you a get, but it's voided. Chazal were concerned that by allowing him to avoid a get, either in person through to the agent or through another agent, he might in fact use that in ways that disturb the wife, and that's not the goal. Now, the fact that the Gemara, that this Gemara understands it, the text of the Mishnah comes to the conclusion that that's not a concern, that we're not worried about that. That is, no husband would be doing that. No husband would be going through that trouble. Doesn't reduce the fact that they were concerned about it. That in fact, as they were creating halacha mipnei tikkun olam, for the betterment of the world, they had in mind, what are the implications, what are the results of this new halacha that we've created? And are they making things better for the wife, or are they not making things better for the wife? And we can only imagine what the conclusion would have been had Chazal said, you know what, in our observation, husbands are trying to vex their wives here. Would they have changed the halacha again? One doesn't know. However, the Gemara does, shortly after this, have a discussion of a principle called a Makadeshin Adaita de Rabbanan, called a Makadesh, Adaita de Rabbanan Makadesh, that in this new world of rabbinic halacha, as it applies not to get but to marriage, called a Makadesh, everyone who gets married under rabbinic ordinance, meaning either with money or with a marriage contract, are presumed to be doing so with the understanding and acceptance of Rabbanan, of the rabbis. And if there's a circumstance under which the rabbis would not have given permission, had they only known, the marriage is nullified. That discussion takes place shortly after the conversation about this Mishnah, and it's entirely conceivable that what the rabbi is asking, well, is the husband trying to vex the wife in the way he's avoiding the get or not, may very well have had that in mind. Any questions? Are people able to speak up? Do we need to unmute you?
Now can we speak up?
Yes, please.
No. Why are you assuming basically? What was the Havamina of the fact that he wanted to create a problem for his wife? He may have just changed his mind, which can happen just as much as anything else. In other words, he changed his mind after he sent the get. So it wasn't
right. And that, yes, Rabbi, can I say correct? And that, in fact, seems to be the maskana of the Gemara in its understanding of the Mishnah. It raised the question of, might the husband be intending to vex the wife, simply to explain the structure of the Mishnah itself. Let us look at the Gemara a little more closely in the English here.
Yeah,
see the question.
Can you show us the rest of the Gemara, because we're very limited in what we can see on this.
Let me see if I can change it here. I'll turn to the Hebrew for a moment. The Gemara learns higia lo katani ela higia. First, it starts with the language of the Mishnah is strange. He reached the husband, higio, below. It doesn't write that. Ela higia. He met him. Be'afilu memela. And even if he met him by happenstance, not intending to meet him, not intending to nullify the get, we might think then that on the spur of the moment he nullifies the get simply to vex the wife. So the Gemara says, no, below amrinan litzaora hu tekamakaven. We don't say that his intent was to vex her. Then the Gemara goes on in analyzing the Mishnah to look at each phrase and asks, why was that next phrase necessary? Wasn't the first phrase enough to tell us? And in each case, in each analysis, the Gemara says, well, we might have thought that we conclude that the husband didn't want to vex the wife, that he intended simply to nullify the get because he regretted having made it when he met the shaliach. But if he sent another shaliach after the first shaliach, perhaps there either the second shaliach wasn't as powerful as the first, his agency isn't as strong, or there the intent was to vex the wife. So there too we conclude, no, we would think that the intent of the husband is to divorce her, not to vex her. And then the Gemara says, okay, but then why do we need the next phrase in the Mishnah? Why do we need to be told that even if he goes to her directly, personally, before the get reaches her, that the get is null and void? And there too, the Gemara says, well, we might have thought that if he's sending a shaliach, that's not to vex her. But if he goes himself personally, he wants to see the annoyance on her face. So we conclude, no, even in that case, the purpose is not to vex her. So, Rabbi Kranz, your observation is correct. In each instance, the conclusion is that he's honorable, that he's not trying to vex her. And I think the importance of this Mishnah for our conversation is the Hava Amina, simply the question that's raised, might the purpose be to vex her? And the fact that the Chazal believe that they need to be concerned for that. let's go on to text 2, which is really a continuation of this Mishnah. The Mishnah in text, it's labeled here text 3. Barishona, in the beginning, Haya ose beitin b'makom acher mevatlo. That if a man wanted to nullify a get after sending it towards his wife, he would simply convene a beitin or go to a beitin in some other place, and he would mevatel it. Hitkin Rabban Gamliel hazaken, shelo yehu osinkein. So Rabban Gamliel hazaken made a takana that this shouldn't be done anymore. Mipnei tikkun olam, for the sake of the improvement, of the betterment of the world. Rashi explains that improving the world, the problem that he needs to obviate is that the shaliach who he sent with the get to his wife doesn't know that out in Yenensville, the husband went to a get and nullified the get, and that the shaliach might in fact deliver the get to his wife. And she, thinking that, oh, I'm divorced, thank God, I'm done with that bum, she'll get married to somebody else based on this get, not knowing that it was nullified. The Gemara asks specifically, my tikkun olam. What, in this case, is the tikkun olam, is the betterment of the world that the rabbis intended? And there's a machloket among the Amoraim. Amar Rav Yochanan mipnei takanat mamzerim. Reish Lakish Amar mipnei takanat agunot. Rav Yochanan says, well, in order to improve the situation of mamzerim, if she gets married and has children, but it turns out that the first divorce was never valid, what's the status of the children of the second marriage? They're mamzerim. Rish Lakish says, no, it's in order to improve the situation of takanat agunot, of the whole aguna situation, since if she receives a get, but she can never be sure that the get wasn't nullified, she might choose not to marry out of fear that, what if I'm still married? I'll be committing adultery.
Why would she assume that she's not married if she heard that you had a get?
Well, the problem could be, according to Rish Lakish, the problem would be that she knows that, well, my husband might very well have nullified the get at a Beit Din somewhere in Yenensville, and I never heard about it. There's, under the original arrangement in which a husband could nullify a get in any Beit Din in any place, and the word might never reach the wife, since nobody would send a shaliach to the wife to say, oh, the get that came 2 months ago is now nullified. A prudent woman might choose not to depend upon the get that she received. That, according to Rish Lakish, is the takana of mishum tikkun olam. Rabbi Yochanan says no, it's to avoid mamzerot. In both cases, what Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are arguing over is not the principle of saying we need to change practice. Rabban Gamliel HaZaken felt that the then current practice needed to be changed because it created societal problems that needed to be fixed. But may tikkun olam. Okay. Now, that I think is an introduction to the notion of mipnei tikkun olam. It goes further, though, and this phrased in the minds of the rabbis of the Mishnah and then of the Gemara that followed, a whole set of questions. If the precedent set, at least initially, by Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, now we'll see earlier incidents of halacha being created, mipnei tikkun olam, a little later on. But this is clearly setting a precedent. Well, if so, what are the parameters? Can any rabbi in any time change halacha mipnei tikkun olam, because that rabbi perceives the societal problem created by the halacha? Are there limitations to the powers of the rabbi, or even of the greatest rabbi of an age, to what halacha can be changed, what halacha can't be changed? These are questions that the Gemara, through analysis of later Mishnayot, struggles with. And a good example is in the next Mishnah. Let me bring it up. Also found in the series of Mishnayot in Gittin Perek Daled, in the 4th chapter of the Mishnah of Gittin. And the Mishnah learns, Ein podin et hashvuin yeter al kedei demehen mipnei tikkun olam. Captives are not redeemed for more than their actual monetary value, mishum tikkun olam, for the improvement of the world. Even though the English is later on, let me continue in the Hebrew, ve'ein mavrichin et hashvuyin mipnei tikkun olam, and when we do not help captives to escape mipnei tikkun olam. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says this ruling that we should not pay more than their value and that we should not help them escape is not mipnei tikkun olam, but mipnei takanat hashvuyin, for the improvement of the condition of those who are being held captive. Before we look at the Gemara, let me ask, how do you understand the difference between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's statement that it's mipnei takanat hashvuyin and the statement of the Stam Mishnah that it's mipnei tikkun olam, that we don't help captives escape mipnei tikkun olam, for the betterment of the world, not for the betterment. It's not for the betterment of the shvuyin, of the captives, or we don't pay an extraordinary sum to redeem them for the betterment of the world. How can we understand the difference? Is there a difference between these two statements?
Well, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is actually more concerned about the shvuyin than he's concerned about tikkun olam. In other words, basically, he's concerned about the fact that he wouldn't be able to go ahead and become free because of the high price. So his concern is specifically with the person rather than the tikkun olam. Or tikkun olam may be a part of it. Let's put it this way. But he specifies that we're concerned about the fact that shvuyin won't be able to become free because of the high price.
Yeah, I think there's a good understanding there. The question that I hear you raising, who was it who just spoke up? I wasn't able to see. Who was that? Who was that who just spoke up?
I spoke up, Moshe Kranzler.
Rabbi Kranzler, thank you. Yes. The question that they raise is mipnei tikkun olam as a reason for creating halacha, for defining halacha. Is that focusing on the needs of the individual or on the needs of society?
That's first one, society. The second one is the needs of the specific.
Right.
One is more general than the other.
So let's see how that plays out in the Gemara. Ibayalahu, a question was asked. Hi mipnei tikkun olam mishum duchta detziburahu. Is the notion of tikkun olam because of the pressure on the community to go out and raise inordinate sums of money? O Dilma, or perhaps for the future captives, for the sake of the future captives who will be taken because of the high ransom being paid for them. That is, the intent is not to induce more kidnapping for ransom. If people know that they can receive a lot of money, they'll be more likely to kidnap. What a great way to go.
But they don't necessarily contradict each other.
I'm sorry?
They complement each other. They don't contradict each other. The betterment for the world includes the second part as well. In other words, there's no conflict between the two. The second one is more specific rather than the first one.
Well, I'm not. Let's take a look. I'm moving on to the next piece of Gemara on the second half, because in fact there may be a strong distinction between the two. Let's see how the Gemara understands it. The Gemara on the part of the Mishnah says v'ein mavrichin shvuan v'bnei tikkun olam, that we don't help the captives escape mishum tikkun olam. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said no, it's not mishum tikkun olam. It is v'bnei takanat shvuyim. It's for the sake of the shvuyim itself. So the Gemara asks, my beinayu, is there a practical difference between these two opinions? Now, if Rabbi Kranzler is correct, that in fact one complements the other, that focusing on the need of the captives individually is an extension, the next step beyond B'nei Tikkun Olam and included in it, then one might say that there is no distinction. If, however, there are two separate understandings of the Mishnah, either we focus on the needs of the society, of the community, even when it runs counter to the needs of the individual, or we identify the needs of the community with the needs of the individual. Well, so the Gemara says, my beinayu, what's the difference? Ika beinayu, here's the difference. The leka el echad. What if there's only one captive? If Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is concerned that those who are being held in captivity now, and one of their fellows escapes, that they may be dealt with more harshly as a result of the escape of the lucky individual. Well, if that's our concern, then if he was the only captive being held at this moment, we should be able to allow it to help him escape, since there's no one else to suffer. If, however, we're concerned with the broader societal issue of perhaps in the future captives will be dealt with more harshly in order to prevent their escape, as this one now escaped, then even though this one, the one who's escaping now, who's all alone and the only captive this time, can't be helped and may be recaptured or dealt with harshly because of that, for the good of the society, we can't help him escape anyway. So I would suggest, my understanding is that in fact the Gemara is facing a hard choice here as a policymaker. They're saying Mipnei Tikkun Olam requires that we focus on the broader needs of society, even if individuals suffer for it. And that we don't create policy with the intent of bettering the situation of an individual. Rather, we create policy for the sake of what's needed by society. If we have a societal problem that kidnapping and holding individuals for ransom has become common, and the desire to pay huge ransoms is there, understandably, if the family wants to pay it out, well, then we have to deal with that. We have to change the practice so that those huge ransoms don't get paid. Or if we want to help an escaping refugee because we feel for them out of compassion, we can't if the implications of that for the broader society are negative. I would suggest that, in fact, this is an issue that policymakers face all the time? Do we make policy with an eye towards what's needed by the individuals who are caught up in the situation in the moment? Or do we make policy based what we believe to be for the broader needs of society, even if it complicates the situation of the individuals who are caught up in the moment? It would seem that Bnei Tikkun Olam focuses on, answers the question with a bias towards the second, not with a bias towards the first. Questions? What time is it? Okay. There's a great story that the Gemara brings at this point. That maybe we'll come back to. I see we don't have time. Having to do with the daughters of Rav Nachman, who Rav Nachman was an Amora in Nahardia, a great leader. He married into the family of the Nasi there, and his two daughters were held captive along with Rav Ishi, who tried to escape. That's the story. That's the headline of the story. What happens might help us understand even further the complications of Pidyon Shavuyin, and I'm putting this in as a teaser. Hopefully, we'll have time to come back to it later. In the meantime, let's go on to a text that brings to light perhaps one of the most famous cases of halacha created b'nei tikkun olam. The halacha of Pruzbal. Min HaTorah, midioraita, when the Shemitah year comes, when the seventh year comes, loans that are outstanding are abrogated or ended. If I were to loan Shmuel money before the Shemitah year, before the seventh year, the Shemitah year comes along, it's not only working the lands that the Shemitah year demands rest, but also it's the money that's outstanding is mishamet, is ended. The loan is ended, and I don't collect my money. That's Torah law. Hillel hitkin Pruzbal b'nei tikkun olam. Hillel Hazaken, the one and original, created Pruzbal because of tikkun olam. The Gemara explains, Tanan Hatam, Pruzbal eno meshamet. Ze echad min hadvarim shehitkin Hillel Hazaken, shera et ha'am shenimneu mehalavot ze et ze. So the Gemara explains, why did Hillel create such a takana? Because he observed that with that when the Shvi'it year, when the Shemitah year required that outstanding loans be forgiven, that people stopped loaning money, and that in fact was bad for society. And so he created the institution of Pruzbal, a document through which the loan was transferred from the creditor to the Beit Din, and the halacha was understood as requiring that individuals who loaned money forgave that loan on the Shemitah year, but monies that were owed to a Beit Din were not forgiven. So Hillel created the Pruzbal that's transferred the debt from an individual, from the creditor to the Beit Din, going around the Shemitah year. That's Pruzbal. Now, this raises a whole series of questions. First, if Shemitah year is a d'oraisa requirement, is Torah law, how could Hillel, who may have been great, but at the end of the day is simply a mere rabbi, nullify that? How could he create halacha to get around it? And furthermore, if we were to be able to answer that question successfully, perhaps by claiming, as we'll see in a moment, that in the time of Hillel, the Shemitah was no longer d'oraita, but now only d'Rabbanan. If that's true, then the Torah law requires that a loan gets repaid. If Rabbi Green were to lend me money, I have a Torah obligation to repay him. Rabbi Green, I see your name on the on my screen here, so you'll forgive me for using you as the example. But I still have a Torah obligation to repay you. How can Hillel come along and say, no, yes, you have a Torah obligation to repay you, but don't bother to repay him, but don't bother? What are the parameters of the power of the rabbis to create law mipnei tikkun olam, for the betterment of the world, even when that betterment is focusing not on the individual, but as we learned in the prior Mishnah, on society as a whole. Just as an aside, before we get into the Gemara itself, this piece of Gemara was became popular among a group of women who referred to themselves, identified as Orthodox Jewish feminists back in the 70s. Blue Greenberg was among these, Rachel Adler. Some of us who were active in the 70s may remember these individuals. They would point to the power that Hillel seems to assume in creating Prizbal, and made the statement, where there's a rabbinic will, there is a rabbinic way. If the rabbis want to make something happen, they can find a way to make it happen. They have the power. The implication of the statement being that since the rabbis aren't making things happen as the Orthodox feminists wanted them to, obviously they don't have the will, but if they had the will, they would be able to find the way.
Except there are certain rules that should be followed before they can do that.
Absolutely.
It's not as easy as all that.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. Let's take a look at the Gemara and understand what some of those rules are. And then we can ask, were Mrs. Greenberg and Mrs. Adler, were they correct, or perhaps were they overstating or misunderstanding the power of even Hillel Hazaki? So we're going to start with the Gemara in the middle, where it says in the Hebrew it's mi ikam midei zemia raisa. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down, and in the English, it's the next page. The Gemara asks. Okay, so let's look at it in the English. The Gemara asks, but is there anything like this whereby Torah law, that is the sabbatical year, cancels the debt, but that Hillel instituted that it does not cancel the debt? The question being, how can Hillel, as great a Tana as he was, as early in the Tanaitic period as he appeared, how can he presume to nullify, to alter a halacha which is d'oraita?
He made a difference between the time of Beis Hamikdash and afterwards.
Right. So that's exactly what the Gemara brings up. The Gemara informs us, teaches us that the Breita is referring to the Shemitah year in the present time.
Right. It's only the Rabbanan.
And it's in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, as it's taught that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi says the verse is in the context of cancellation of debts. When the Torah says that debts are to be abrogated, to be canceled in the Shemitah year, it connects it with all the other laws of the Shemitah year. We know that those laws of the Shemitah year ended, their application ended with the Chorban Bayat HaRishon, and with the Galut into Bavel. Once Jews, the majority of Jews, were no longer living in Israel, Shemitah year no longer applied. And when they returned to Israel, the knot was undone. The halacha, the d'oraita, was no longer would apply. However, the rabbis decided, you know what? We want to keep the memory of the Shemitah year alive, even though the Torah would no longer apply it to our situation now that we've returned from exile in Babel. But we don't want people to forget it entirely. And so, Zecher, in memorial, as a reminder, we are going to, under the authority of the rabbis now, not under the authority of the Torah, continue the practice of nullifying loans, of abrogating is a better word, of abrogating loans that were existing before the Shemitah year. And so, as Rabbi Krasler pointed out, the halacha that Hillel was addressing was not a d'oraita. He wasn't changing d'oraita law. He was only changing d'rabbanan law. That's the first question. Well, then the Gemara asks the second question. Okay, that might be so. And Hillel, as the great rabbi of his time, has the authority to do that. But then we're faced with the other question. If by the Torah law, if Rabbi Green loans me money, I have the obligation to pay him back. Min Torah. How can Hillel come along and say, no, Alpert, don't worry, the Torah might require you to pay it back, but I'm telling you it's forgiven? How can Hillel have presume the authority to do that? For that we say, well, there is a principle, Hefker Beit Din Hefker. The Beit Din has the power, has the authority to decide whom does property belong to. And if the Beit Din declares a piece of property which I believe to be mine, or in this case, which Rabbi Green believes to be his because he loaned it to me, if he believes that it's still his, that's nice, but the Beit Din has the authority to say no, because all property really belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara here answers the first question and begins to identify the parameters through which the rabbis can create or even change halacha by stating first, that only applies to rabbinic law. It cannot change Torah law. Second, the Gemara here goes on to discuss how can change be made? How can under what circumstances can a prior rabbinic halacha be altered by a later rabbinic court? And it begins to outline the process through which that might be done. First, and mainly the Beit Din that's going to change the halacha has to be greater, gadol mimena, greater than the first Beit Din, b'chachma over minyan, in wisdom and in numbers. There are different arguments as to what this means. How can any Beit Din be greater in wisdom than the earlier Beit Din, than the Beit Din of Hillel, for sure? And how can a Beit Din be greater in numbers, since the number of individuals in the Beit Din is generally set by halacha? And so the Rishonim come to understand this requirement as being, first, it has to be, the Beit Din has to be relative in its generation, as wise, as knowledgeable, as the Beit Din that set the halacha was relative to its own generation. Similarly, it needs to be as broadly accepted, the numbers. It needs to be accepted by as many people in the society as the original Beit Din was. If such a condition, if such two conditions were met, then theoretically a later Beit Din could come and change and alter the halacha that was created by an earlier Beit Din. And it could do this mipnei tikkun olam, if it saw that society required that change. However, absent a Beit Din being gadol mimena b'chachma v'minyan, the change can't be made. Now, I see that the time is getting late. I know that we had started late, but I believe we're compelled to finish on time. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming. For next week, we will. There are two more Mishnayot that we'll choose to look at in dealing with Bnei Tikkun Olam, and then looking at a list of the of all of the halacha that was created with Bnei Tikkun Olam. Ask the question: exactly what did the rabbis mean, and how does the understanding of Bnei Tikkun Olam, how the understanding like existed in the time of the Mishnah, how does that differ from the meaning that's been ascribed to that phrase Tikkun Olam today in contemporary times, especially in liberal religious communities? That's a question that we'll ask and hopefully answer. We'll then go on to take a look at how halacha, how Chazal created halacha, not mibnei tikkun olam, but using a different phrase that they used, mibnei drachei hashalom, for the sake of the paths of peace. How is that different from mibnei tikkun olam? And does it speak of a different vision for society between those Chazal in one period, an earlier period, who created halacha mibnei tikkun olam, and Chazal in a later period, still in the Mishnaic time, but after Churban Abayit, who began speaking about Mipnei Darchei HaShalom. Thank you, and hopefully...
I have a question, please.
Yes.
I have a question, Rabbi. Okay. I just want to go back to the beginning about the get. Now, if a man doesn't want to give a woman a get, what category is the man in? Can he go and marry on his own, or something has to be resolved? How does the man come out in this situation?
Well, so there is a practice. That's a great question. There is a practice called heter mea rabbanim. That
okay.
However, the difference is that midioraita, a man is allowed to have more than one wife. Right now, there was a gezerah in the 10th century, gezerah Rabbeinu Gershon, which disallowed that. Some will say that, in fact, that gezerah was only for 1,000 years. The 1,000 years is up, and if a man wants to go out and take a second wife, gesund to hate, I don't know any man who would dare do that. Any married man who would dare do that. His wife won't stand for it.
But you know what? I hate to say this, but I'm only saying this because my daughter was an aguna for 10 years. Okay. And he didn't want to give her. So I have a lot of things, questions going on here. Number one, I blame the Rabbanim for keeping this going. They seem to favor the man all the time. And for whatever reason, I have no idea. But and in the Jewish press, they have a whole page of men who don't want to give their women a get. And the same people are in year after year. It's years already, many years.
Right.
And I think in something that I read, one of the men who didn't want to give his wife a get went and remarried and publicized it. There was a picture of him and his new wife. And this was in Las Vegas a number of years ago. I mean, I can say the name. I don't know them, but whatever. This fella, his last name was Kin, K-I-N. Whatever. And you know what? I said to myself, how do they sanction another man getting married to a woman, or even if a woman has any loyalty to her own self, or worthwhile, would marry even a man who was married and wouldn't give his wife a get.
Who said the rabbi sanctioned that?
Yeah. So let's admit that this is a tremendous personal tragedy, but
the rabbis are letting it happen.
And the aguna problem, just as it was in the time of the Mishnah, is a societal issue that calls out for correction, right? And we saw that Mibnei Tikkun Olam, the aguna issue, was the reason for creating for changing the halacha so that a man cannot nullify a get before whatever Beit Din anywhere in the world, and his wife may never know that. Okay, so that's a terrible, terrible personal tragedy, and the rabbinic body,
Unfortunately, it's not me only. There's
of course
many,
not.
many women out there this is happening to.
Right.
And it should stop. And the rabbis have to come out and come together for this purpose. And you don't know what this does to the children that are involved. No one even thinks about that. I have a granddaughter that was involved in this. She didn't see her father for years. And so thank God my daughter remarried. And this new father is more of a father to her than the old one. And it affects the children terribly. And nobody cares about the kids. They only worry about the mother. And nobody cares what kind of a person is this man who doesn't give his wife a get. What and he can come from the most frum families in the most frum part of Brooklyn or Muncie. And everybody says that what he does is he doesn't pay for his terrible mistakes.
So let me try to address this, because I think that certainly Rabbanim today, the Rabbanut today, is very much aware of the problem. To some
they don't
degree,
do anything.
And let's discuss what is being done, and why more isn't being done.
Okay.
What is being done, because I know they do take it seriously. I'll give you 3 examples. First, it must be, we're in 1920, so 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, an Orthodox group of Rabbanim, came out with the RCA a prenuptial agreement, a legally binding agreement, for the husband and wife to agree to before the marriage, which identifies financial penalties that the husband will have to pay, and quite strong financial penalties, which the husband will have to pay if he reaches a situation where there's a civil divorce and he refuses to give a get. So that's one attempt, and it has worked. I know many Orthodox rabbis, including myself, will not perform a wedding ceremony, without that prenuptial agreement. Now, I can say that in some parts of the Orthodox world, there is still tremendous resistance to that. Second, so something which is more rarely used, I did refer earlier to the Gemara's dictum called a Makadesh Shedaita de Rabbana Makadesh, that all marriages are presumed to be with the agreement, with the permission of the Rabbanut. The second half of that statement is the Inhu Rabbanan L'Kiddushin Minei, and the rabbis have the power to refuse permission for a marriage, even retroactively. And there are a few cases, one that I'm personally aware of, in which really great sages involved nullified a marriage in which the husband was shown to have psychological problems that he had, but which were unknown at the time of the marriage, and which led to all sorts of psychological misbehavior towards the wife. And the nullification of the marriage itself was on the basis of, had we known at the time that this was the situation, we would not have granted our permission to the marriage, and so the marriage is nullified. It's a very, very rare and difficult procedure. What makes it difficult is really, I think, the tragedy of our time. As I mentioned, the process for allowing halacha to be changed, mibnei tikkun olam even, requires a beit din which is gadol, greater than the first, b'chachma u'b'minyan, which means that it has to be broadly accepted. Unfortunately, in our situation, in the galus in which we are currently suffering, we are so splintered And sometimes for ideological reasons, sometimes perhaps for ego reasons, we are so splintered that there is no single Beit Din or no group of Batei Dinim that has broad acceptance, and that limits what the Rabbanut can do tremendously. So in the example that I spoke of just a moment ago, a situation in which I know, in which a woman who was in an aguna situation, but for whom the Beit Din, and again, the Beit Din included two individuals who were of great renown and broadly respected in the yeshivish world. She had her her marriage nullified on the basis of a psychological, emotional problem that it was now known that the husband had at the time of the marriage, but which wasn't divulged then. Well, the problem is that despite the greatness of the Rav who allowed this, other yeshiva, Rosh Yeshiva, in other places in the world said, no, we can't do that. The woman can't marry, and if she has any more children, they'll be mamzerim. And so while the woman no longer considers herself an aguna, and in this case did remarry very happily, she and her husband have not had more children. She brought a child to the marriage. He brought a child to the marriage, the second husband. But there are no more children because what we know is, even though this great Rav, head of a great yeshiva, said everything is fine and dandy, the political situation within, what we suffer in our galus is such that if Rav X says mutar, Rav Y will dafka say asur. Mashiach should come quickly, and that situation should be resolved. My point being is that yes, it is a personal tragedy, and I wish that more rabbis had the courage of the conviction that this particular Rosh Yeshiva had to step forward and do what he did. But I recognize that the situation of our world is such is that it's not yet possible in many ways.
Can I add something to that, please, Rabbi?
Please.
I just wanted to mention the fact that in Israel they've tried other methods. They've locked up the husband until he would say Rotzandi. So there have been a number of cases where in Israel, because they were locked up and they couldn't get out of jail until they gave a get to their wife, some worked. But I know one person, I understand he was so adamant that he died in jail rather than give his wife a get. And also the question of hetamei rabbonim is not used frequently. It's used in cases primarily where people have mental health conditions and they cannot go ahead and be released in any other way. So they use the hetamei rabbonim, but it's not used.
It should be that way, and most of the times it is, but unfortunately that is abused sometimes. Look, even here in the States, and I know this woman who I was referring to, who eventually had her wedding nullified. I know that the family hired somebody, a service that was operating out of Muncie for a while, that unfortunately hit the news, to try to use physical inducement to beat the guy up until he would say, do it. Tosfos discusses that, because after all, a get has to be given voluntarily. Right. And the Gemara says that you can hire Shmuley Shmuley is 350 pounds. Imagine him as a linebacker for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You can hire Shmuley, who only L'Shem Shemayim will apply physical pressure to this husband until he says, Toso asks, how is that possible? How can you call that free will? And the answer actually is learned from the Parsha of 2 weeks ago with Paro. She says, what Paro really did want to do the right thing. He wanted to let the Jews out, to go, not to hold them in, but his ego kept him from doing that. So the pressure applied by Kadosh Baruch Hu through the Makos simply gave Paro the strength to do that which he wanted to do. Actually, in his case, it was the opposite. I'm sorry. He didn't want to let them go, and each time he said that, I'll let them go, he was doing it because of the force. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by strengthening his heart, was giving him the power to do what he really wanted. With the husband, Tosfos says, the husband really wants to do the right thing. He wants to give that get. He knows that his wife is miserable and that both need to move on. However, his ego, his id, his pride is keeping him from doing that. So all that Shmuel is doing by applying the 350 pounds of pressure and all that means is giving him the strength, the inner strength to do that which he really wants to do in the first place. But what those in Muncie who were organizing these things found out, unfortunately for them, was that is against the law in the United States, and I believe people were imprisoned for it.
Yes, I know. I heard about that.
Okay, let's. I thank everyone for listening so patiently.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You're really terrific. You're really terrific.
Thank you.
I wish you were on